So, whenever you're ready, the title of the panel was "From the War on Poverty, the War on Crime, the Rise of Punitive Policy at the Federal, State, and Local Levels." How would you gauge the level of audience interest and the quality of the papers?
Well, this panel was very well attended, and I think it's in part because the historical community is getting very interested in studying the rise of this really punitive carceral state that we have today and what its historical roots are. And we had amazing panelists, 3 women who were really unpacking and uncovering the roots of this massive carceral state and locating it in the 60s and the 70s, and looking at the politics that generated it and looking at the culture that generates it. So I thought the panel was fabulous and gave us a great deal to think about.
Where did they trace the rise of the punitive state? From 1968 forward, the Nixon administration?
Well, that's what's interesting. I think traditionally the way historians understood it was that there was a spike in crime, and then with Nixon, people began clamoring for a war on crime. And these papers were very interesting because they actually take us into the moment that's the Great Society and the war on poverty, and get us to really think much more critically about the origins of this war on crime and this carceral state earlier in the Johnson administration, with liberal Republicans like Rockefeller, with liberal presidents like Johnson, and within liberal programs like the Great Society.
So can you cite some specific examples for the papers?
Oh my, let me think. Well, I mean, one Julie Kohler-Hausman was talking a lot about the transition from indeterminate to determinate sentencing, and really locating the important movement for that in reformers and prisoners themselves that had very unintended consequences in terms of how it would lead to its close relative mandatory sentencing, which then would really build up the carceral state. We had some really interesting information from Elizabeth Kai Hinton talking about how programs that we often think of as sort of community-based ways to make communities safer, such as the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Act of '74, become really a way to make communities of color much more criminalized, and then in turn leads to a real buildup of record numbers of black and brown youth being incarcerated. And Jessica Neptune had a very interesting paper talking about how in the Great Society moment, there is actually a moment where people are thinking about alternatives to incarceration rather than prisons, thinking about ways to do community policing, or to think about ways to manage crime on the ground. And then she tries to identify that shift. Then when does that turn into more punitive measures? And in my comment, I encouraged all of the papers to think a little bit less about maybe transition from a moment of rehabilitative model to a moment of punitive and retributive model, and to actually think historically about the ways in which liberal notions of crime management and conservative notions of crime management really got wedded in this period, because they both shared an abiding concern with communities of color in cities, and disorder in cities, disorder which they really conflate with crime. And that we need to think about the way in which crime policy that we lay on Nixon was in fact an enterprise that both liberal and conservative politicians were very interested in for similar reasons, which was about maintaining a certain degree of control of community.